This plant right here is known as cherry laurel, and it is an example of an invasive species. But what exactly are invasive species and why do they cause such a problem? Invasive species can simply be defined by a species that occupies a territory from which it's not native. And in order for it to be classed as an invasive species, it must be able to sustain itself within this new territory via the establishment of a viable population. And when this happens, it usually results in this invasive species changing the environment and its composition of the ecosystem significantly, and unfortunately often for the worse. A big part of the reasoning as to why these invasive species tend to be so successful in their newfound environments is because these new environments possess no real threat to them in the sense of predation or disease. If we take Japanese knotweed, for example, in Japan, it's attacked by around 180 different invertebrates and around 50 species of fungus, whereas in the UK, those things simply don't exist, which allow it to run rampant. We can also see an example of this in the red and marled lionfish. Invasive species to the Atlantic, they have no natural predators there, meaning that they can damage the ecosystem and consume other species smaller than themselves without being challenged. It's also worth mentioning that invasive species don't have to be from vastly different regions to cause a problem. Hedgehogs, for example, are native to the United Kingdom. However, when they were introduced to the Hebrides as a means to control pests in gardens during the 1970s, they decimated ground nesting bird populations. Besides actively attacking native species, invasive species can also outcompete natives for resources, and they can even spread diseases. If we take the grey squirrel, for example, squirrel pox doesn't actively impact them, but it does impact the red squirrel, often proving fatal to them. Join me tomorrow where we'll take a closer look at the impact of invasive species and how they are actually introduced into different areas in the first place. Until then, stay fresh, cheese bags.